The last sequence, the final seconds of Atlantis' existence, were shown to me on the holographic screen, and involved great drama. The last outstanding achievement of that extraordinary civilization, which I saw sink into the waters, was the huge glowing pyramid that throned in the center of the Atlantean continent, near the spaceport. It was much larger than the current pyramids of Egypt, with perfectly smooth sides like translucent metal. I was shown only those moments, the moments when the top of the pyramid was sinking into the huge waves. At the top of the pyramid I saw a lighthouse, which was actually a crystal which pulsed intermittently like a laser, until it was dislodged and destroyed by the enormous waves created by the terrible cataclysm. Simultaneously I was shown from above, somehow superimposed on that dramatic moment of swirling waters, in which the huge pyramid was sinking, the image of the Atlantic Ocean, which had then become just a vast expanse of water without any large land area. In that way I was shown the complete end of Atlantis, which beyond the very sad visual moment, brought with it a feeling of great suffering and heartbreak, which I perceived acutely, like a despairing cry of the sunken continent. It was the last cry of a great civilization, which belonged to the ENL branch. The Great Meeting and the Plan to Save Mankind. As previously stated, knowing in advance of the impending cataclysm to come, the sages who ruled Atlantis wanted to preserve much of the knowledge of their civilization, but at the same time sought to sustain the evolution of the remaining ENK branch of beings after Atlantis. They knew that the branch that led to the formation of Atlantean civilization and its heights, the ENL branch, would decline and even disappear, so they set out to support the evolution of the other branch ENK, using the high knowledge they had acquired up to that point. Immediately after the images of the total sinking of the continent, I was shown a very large gathering of human and alien beings under a huge dome in a mountainous area, but I could not identify the exact place on Earth where this happened. In some ways, that gathering resembled the Great Planetary Council of 28,000 years ago, but the gathering after Atlantis was more hectic and the proportion of humans in it was higher. Even so, I was able to see an amazing variety of races, both human and alien. I estimated the number of beings present at that meeting to be more than 250 souls. I was telepathically given to understand that there was a nursery of forms and races there, who had answered the call for help from the wise ENL beings, even before Atlantis had completely disappeared. Because of the great tension that had been generated by the planetary cataclysm that had just taken place, I could see that the meeting held signs of obvious concern in some of the participants, an unspoken fear that persisted, and even a certain nervousness that manifested itself in them. There in that special meeting, very important decisions were made about the further evolution of our planet and ENK beings. Tactically speaking, then and there, the main coordinates of humanity's future destiny were set. From one point of view, those were even more concrete and effective decisions than those made at the Great Planetary Council of 26,000 BC, because the situation was dramatic and the very failure of the original project of forming intelligent and spiritually evolved human beings was at stake. Humanity risked either disappearing into anonymity or self-destruction. Watching the images, I couldn't help but notice that at that council there was actually some sort of negotiation, of areas on Earth that were distributed to each alien civilization to be replenished. Initially, I thought their representatives were interested in the resources underground or the area of influence they received. Soon, however, I realized that this was not the criterion for negotiation, but rather the condition that there be a large ENK population in the assigned area. The participants in that meeting were asking for this, in order to be able to make genetic changes in the DNA structure of that population, that would follow the characteristics of the alien race that was overseeing its evolution. It was therefore a redistribution of the zones of influence that had been established some 14,000 years ago at the Great Planetary Council of Teotihuacan, only now, after the sinking of Atlantis, the global situation was much more critical. Collapse of the vibrational frequency of consciousness. The cataclysm not only influenced the physical structure of the planet's crust, but also caused changes in its vibrational frequency, affecting the energetic condition of the subtle planes attached to the Earth. It was a general fall in all respects, and humanity took a very big step backwards. Many of the results achieved so far on the path of evolution of the human race were almost annihilated by that huge cataclysm, which had global negative repercussions. Among other things, an entire ENL civilization, from what I have seen, the Atlantean civilization was the last of its kind on Earth, exceptional in its technological and spiritual advancement, had disappeared under the waters, along with a large number of evolved beings and the astonishing achievements of its progress. Knowledge, experience and advancement in all the sciences of the time had been annihilated in a relatively short period of time. The evolutionary resources of mankind had suddenly become very limited, as almost all the beings still inhabiting the planet at that time were still poorly evolved ENK beings. All this I could feel telepathically and also as a kind of impregnation of a specific state of those times, after the Great Cataclysm. Under other circumstances, I would have described that situation as somewhat desperate for humanity, but the immediate mobilization of surviving Atlantean sages, and some of the advanced extraterrestrial civilizations, diminished over the next 1,000 years from the terrible collapse in energy and consciousness that had occurred through the disappearance of the great civilization of Atlantis. The plan to sustain and restore humanity. One of the first steps of that mobilization was the emergency gathering of extraterrestrial civilizations, interested in helping rebuild the accelerated evolution chain of human beings. This was the meaning of the resharing of the extraterrestrial areas of influence, both in the material reconstruction of human civilization and in the scientific, knowledge and spiritual realms. At the same time, the nursery of the human DNA gene pool was to be enriched and improved through hybridization and genetic modification of the DNA of ENK beings. This was necessary because the heritage of ENL beings had been largely lost, both due to the cataclysm and their progressive retreat into the etheric plane. The new distribution of alien zones of influence on Earth was to bring a fresh breath of life into the DNA structure of ENK beings, to allow them to understand and rebuild at least some of the knowledge of evolved ENL beings. Therefore, human beings in such an alien zone of influence have over time manifested some characteristics of the civilization with which they were hybridized, because their DNA had combined to some extent with the DNA of that alien civilization. They were like sons of that civilization, which thus contributed to the structural complexity of human DNA. For example, the extraterrestrials wanted to know how many combinations the DNA of ENK beings was capable of supporting, what the nature and peculiarities of those combinations were, what the limits of the genome structure were, how many extensions it could withstand. Naturally, the representatives of each alien civilization had a certain margin within which they could control the DNA of ENK beings, and this involved only the domain that was related to the specifics of their DNA. But I didn't quite understand why alien civilizations wanted to experiment with this, beyond the altruistic desire to participate in the genetic experiment of forming a very complex being. They probably wanted to revive and improve their DNA, or were planning a displacement of ENK beings to other planets. It wasn't clear to me, but I didn't press the point either. However, I realized that for many advanced civilizations that was a unique galactic opportunity that could not be ignored because its potential was so great. I suppose that was a good reason why many alien civilizations answered the call, in addition to those of the Alliance, coming from a sector of the galaxy that was closer. Some personal considerations. The description of how things went with Atlantis at that time does not coincide in all those who have spoken or written about it. Most often, in the expositions that are made by various authors, there is a combination of true and imaginary elements, in which unfortunately the imaginary ones predominate. Also, the lack of detail or precise description of important aspects means that the knowledge about the distant periods of mankind remains somewhat blurred or poorly understood, especially as many are unaware of the parallel existence that ENL beings were able to have on the etheric plane, where ENK beings, being less developed, had no access. Of course, it could be argued that even my presentation regarding the true history of mankind could be false, or that it could be just a product of my imagination. After all, why should the reader believe me more than other authors who have presented their own version of events in mankind's very distant past? The situation is sensitive because clear, indubitable evidence of a physical nature cannot be made public today, even if it were possible now. This is how the system works, these are its requirements and obligations. We can't do everything we want because we are part of a society that is still strongly antagonistic. More or less hidden interests often deprive human beings of true knowledge, and many of the elements that have been discovered cannot yet be presented to the world, for various reasons. Some of these reasons are justified and have sense, given the level of culture and understanding of mankind today. But the question always remains whether they are enough to prevent the truth from being revealed in directions that are kept top secret and ultra top secret. For example, the elements related to the true history of mankind, I have been allowed to present only some of the landmarks of this, not all that I have managed to watch. Even so, there remains the question of the credibility of the facts and aspects presented, but this is already an individual matter. It is up to the reader's own judgment, knowledge and intuition about the aspects I present. The reader is faced with difficult choices, because he may invoke information from other authors that does not coincide with what I have written here. In some cases, this may lead to confusion or even a kind of rejection, as he might feel deceived in his expectations or manipulated by the nature of the revelations on one subject or another, revelations that differ from author to author. In such cases nothing can be done. The only element I can invoke in addition would be that, as far as I am concerned, I have actually seen these fragments of human history, almost as one watches films on a screen, but at an incomparably higher level of technology and synthesis. The viewing was coupled with processes of telepathic transmission and intuitive understanding, driven by interaction with that advanced technology at the level of the cortex. My descriptions can be taken as such or not, which is up to each individual. However, with the information I present here, correlations can be made and things can be understood that have not been never explained before, which is an important starting point for individual analysis. Interdimensional portals. In the distant period of Atlantis, or rather the Hyperborean civilization, ENL beings had evolved so much that they began to be recognized by highly evolved extraterrestrial civilizations. The possibilities of our planet at that time were more extensive, because the Earth offered not only the physical plane, but also the etheric plane, which some of the beings on its surface could reach. At that time, the physical and etheric planes had fairly close frequencies, even though many of the areas and points of confluence between them had disappeared in the wake of the terrible Tars War. Even during Atlantis, there was not much difference between the physical and etheric planes as they are today. The initiated knew how to consciously move from one plane to the other, and especially how to distinguish between them. For ENL beings, that was a common and very natural practice, but even for some of the ENK beings who were more developed, crossing over to the etheric plane through the many portals that existed at that time was perfectly possible and easy to do. These interactions between the physical and etheric planes were many, and the physical merged with the etheric in a very natural way. In many places on the Earth's surface, especially in the northern hemisphere, there were such gateways or even vast territories of manifestation of the etheric plane, which is superior to the physical in vibrational frequency. In fact, many of the unknowns, mysteries and mythological events of ancient history can be explained precisely by that characteristic of the times tens of thousands of years ago, when the physical dimension merged with the subtle etheric one. It is true, however, that access through those gates between planes was intended primarily for evolved ENL beings, or demigods, and less so, if at all, for primitive ENK beings, who viewed such manifestations with great fear, attributing supernatural dimensions to them. Entering the etheric plane through those portals was only valid for a certain initiated segment of the population. This is important because it made it possible to save a part of the wise beings of Atlantis at the time of its sinking, and to establish those beings in different parts of the planet. But the most important aspect is that the existence of interdimensional portals on the planet's surface, even if fewer than in the old days, has made it possible to maintain links and communication with evolved extraterrestrial beings and the higher etheric plane. After the cataclysm, faced with the imminent danger of the destruction of Atlantis, some of the beneficently oriented ENL beings migrated and sought help from evolved ENL elite groups in other areas, as well as from highly advanced alien civilizations. It was a defining moment, and then the decision was made at the galactic and planetary level that this issue should be fixed or at least lessened in its severity. Therefore, the Syrian beings began to incarnate into the evolved and beneficial ENL beings that still existed on Earth to fully support this restoration process, and to once again sustain the cradle of human civilization. This was possible because, as I mentioned, a large proportion of ENL beings had reached an advanced degree of evolution that allowed for the incarnation of wise extraterrestrial beings into physical ENL bodies. After the fall of Atlantis, it was necessary for the ENK human being, as we know it as Homo sapiens, to evolve at an accelerated rate. Until then, and generally speaking, ENK beings were left to evolve freely, without precise direction. Occasionally, they would get a boost through various kinds of alien hybridizations, which turned out to be more or less successful. The DNA complexity of ENK beings was high, but with no qualitative targeting. The K branch evolved more slowly, just through its own experience. When the destruction of the Atlantean continent became imminent and nothing more could be done, the sages and a small part of the learned noble class left the area, either heading for other star systems with which Atlantis had close trade and diplomatic ties, retreating to Shambhala to help humanity there, or migrating to several areas of the planet, mostly to Egypt, South America or the eastern and northern parts of Europe. At the time of the sinking of Atlantis, a large part of the population retreated into the interior of the Earth, mostly due to the decision to leave the ENK branch free to evolve. At first, there were only ENL beings there, but then, over the thousands of years that followed, the inner cavity of the planet became populated with ENK beings as well. The first to retreat there were the demigods, and then, gradually, ENK beings who had evolved far enough came. What I noticed, and what I found interesting, was that the Atlanteans who remained on Earth did not travel to other areas using transportation. They neither traveled by water vessels nor flew in their high-performance aircraft. What happened in those last weeks and days before the final destruction was actually a passage through the ethereal plane, over land. For example, they arrived in Egypt by going over land, having first passed into the etheric plane, and then returned to the physical plane when they arrived in what was called Kem, the land of the Black Earth in North Africa, which is later Egypt. Centers and initiatory lines. With the sinking of Atlantis, our planet's overall vibrational frequency has experienced a dramatic collapse. It was therefore necessary to implement spiritual lines and higher teachings among the remaining majority ENK populations on the Earth's surface, so that the evolution of humanity would not be blocked. Therefore, each civilization or group of civilizations, together with the Atlanteans, took something in this direction. By then, many of the Alliance civilizations that took part in the process of forming the human race, had implemented their own DNA or genetic influence in the basic DNA, designed by the most advanced of them. They followed for some time the development of those characteristics in human beings, and then, when they considered their mission complete, withdrew from their assigned area of influence on Earth, especially after the Great Planetary Council of 26,000 BC. After the destruction of Atlantis, however, it was the first time that the civilizations at the head of the Galactic Alliance, with Shambhala as its central forum, asked for help to start collaborating with other civilizations in the galaxy, and to act on Earth to restore at least part of what was lost in the planetary and Atlantean cataclysm, in terms of knowledge, spirituality, science and technology. From what I saw on the holographic screen, I could tell that their action was swift and effective. I noticed that the implementation of spiritual lines and teachings, in that period had to be carried out directly. The variant before the destruction of Atlantis, when the king or sage imparted various notions and initiations to the people, was no longer valid, for after the almost complete withdrawal of the ENL beings, the population had already begun to divide into different categories of thought and action. People needed not only royal lines, but also lines of wisdom, spiritual paths, that were separate from royalty. As a result, after the destruction of Atlantis, those teachings had to be offered, especially in the beginning, by the wise Atlantean and extraterrestrial beings themselves who came among humans and initiated them into various fields of science and spirituality. I saw in those images how they brought that knowledge, first among small groups, then in the initiatory schools formed, and eventually in more complex systems of teaching involving elements of higher technology. Thus, some peaks were formed among ENK beings, who then increasingly propagated that knowledge among larger populations of humans, giving rise to higher lineages and systems of thought. The importance of the ENK branch. Gradually, watching those images, I began to realize with amazement that in fact the K branch was of major interest to all those alien civilizations. It was astonishing, and even inexplicable to me, to see that the most unfortunate branch of DNA development of the human being could give rise to such a great interest in terms of genetic development. As I said, from the very beginning ENK beings were left to evolve somewhat on their own, by their own experience. In their case there was no massive intervention, as was the case with ENL beings who were constantly refined, enriched with new frequencies and honed at the DNA level. The main reason lay in a certain rigidity of the genetic manipulation of this branch. The K branch was very mobile in different types of crosses, but not very evolved. In contrast to the genetic malleability of the ENL branch, the ENK branch did not have the ability to handle high frequencies in the DNA macromolecule, which resulted in a slow evolution in its case, especially since it was not helped by external impulses. To my justified astonishment, the man from Apellos explained that a very interesting argument lay behind such a decision about ENK beings. The alien civilizations in the Alliance had become very interested in the ENK gene, because of the particular vitality it manifested through the specific DNA structure of its branch. The ENK branch had retained and even developed a vital energy intrinsic to the being, that made it very productive, resilient and stable. It is no coincidence that most human beings on the surface of the Earth were ENK beings at that time, which is still true today. They integrated best into the Earth's biosphere and resonated effectively with it. At a certain point in evolution, even if the refinement and level of consciousness is not very high, the vital side matters enormously, because it provides the fuel necessary for the continuity of the gene without it decaying quickly. Vitality is both a regenerator and a condenser of energy for the evolving being. In the case of the K branch, it has provided DNA with the possibility to make numerous interatomic combinations within the macromolecule itself. This made it a fertile field for possible combinations with other types of DNA, but with a high vital energy. However, not all ENK beings were at a primitive level along the evolutionary line. Some of them had hybridized with higher DNA, most often with ENL beings, but also with extraterrestrial beings. Even if the results were not spectacular at first, over time the genetic changes were transmitted and, at least in certain lines of influence and in certain areas, ENK beings became very powerful, radiant, charismatic and even endowed with paranormal powers. As I said, legends and myths, which actually tell us about extraordinary events that happened in reality, refer to such beings as demigods, human beings endowed with special abilities, far superior to ordinary ENK beings. There were also intermediate levels of development, but most ENK beings were at an early stage of evolution. Because ENK beings were spread all over the globe, their level of consciousness also differed greatly. We have seen, for example, small communities of higher ENK beings living very close to communities of primitive ENK beings, just as in our cities we see everything from academics to beggars, or developed cities next to primitive tribes living in the same area or zone of the Earth. Reforming human civilization. As I said, after the cataclysm of Atlantis, knowledge began to be shared with people in different parts of the globe. Then medicine, astrological knowledge, alchemy, and other remarkable sciences began to appear, which were not known before among ENK beings. I have seen, in a synthetic scroll and exemplary images, how they were implemented little by little, to enable the more rigid consciousness of ENK beings to assimilate everything correctly and use that dowry further effectively. Much knowledge has been given through myths and legends, and many celestial events have been expressed through stories that spoke of gods and goddesses. Until then, knowledge represented a whole, for as far as I could see, it was all part of essential spiritual knowledge. But after the disappearance of Atlantis, it was necessary to segment and explain these areas in the sense of the ENK branch, in order to be closer to their specifics. Some tended to study, others to devote themselves to the arts, and a few to tackle the esoteric sciences. This is why the Atlantean sages, together with those representing some of the alien civilizations of the Alliance, each took on a field of their own vibration frequency to implement in the knowledge of humans, ENK beings. All the great gods that followed in the ancient Egyptian tradition, Thoth, Ra, etc., were continuators of this spiritual branch of reforming human civilization, of sustaining it spiritually. In fact, the first ancient civilization that really mattered in the evolution of ENK beings was the Egyptian civilization. The few superior ENL beings who remained after the fall of Atlantis, and who sought help from advanced extraterrestrial beings had to maintain contact with them, and built the huge pyramids that still stand today. Because in reality, the three great pyramids of Egypt are just that, centers of subtle communication, and not the version claimed by some historians, Egyptologists and contemporary scholars who refer to them as megalomaniac constructions, that served a single purpose, the burial of the pharaoh. Few of them have the courage to assert that the Atlanteans, refugees in Egypt and other places on Earth, such as Central and South America, Eastern Europe and even China, were assisted by some advanced alien civilization in the design and construction of these pyramids, as I will describe later. At that time, large spherical Syrian ships were long gone from the sky. As I have been shown fleetingly, The presence of ships in the sky was continuous until about 350,000 BC, then occasional until about 330,000 BC, and very rare until a period I have estimated at about 130,000 BC. By that time, there was already a developed civilization in southern Africa, including a very large number of ENL beings. After that, during the flowering of Lemurian civilization in the Pacific, another Syrian ship appeared in the sky, also huge, but I have not seen details of it. On the sky, however, I saw that it was accompanied by several other types of large extraterrestrial craft, though smaller than the Syrian ship. It was pointed out to me that, much later, some of the alien ships would play an important role in the history of Egyptian civilization, helping to build the pyramids and other great temples after the sinking of Atlantis.